By the fourth night of a storm that would later be called the 9-day whiteout, a family walked out into weather that could kill a person in 20 minutes, feeling their way along a rope strung between two houses because the fire in their own home had already died. They were walking toward the one house in the valley everyone had laughed at 3 months earlier for wasting good straw on something as strange as a wall. Tonight, that house was the only one still warm.
Over the years, I've had the good fortune to meet a good many retirees whose money simply seems to last comfortably, decade after decade, without any great fortune or unusually large pension behind them. And I've met just as many who started out with considerably more and watched it dwindle away faster than anyone expected. The difference between the two, almost every single time, has had far less to do with how much they had, and rather more to do with a small handful of quiet habits, practiced so consistently, they'd almost stopped noticing them. Today I want to share 7 of those habits with you, the ones I've seen again and again in the retirees, whose money genuinely lasts. Number 4 is the one that surprises people most, because it isn't really about spending less at all. Let's walk through this together, warmly and without any judgment for wherever you currently find yourself. Before we begin, let me say plainly that this isn't a video about being wealthy. Every single person I'm about to describe to you lived on a perfectly ordinary pension. What set them apart wasn't the size of the number arriving each month, but the quiet, almost invisible discipline of a few particular habits, repeated so many times over so many years that they simply became who these people were, rather than something they had to consciously remember to do. Number 1, they know their number precisely rather than roughly. I think of a gentleman named Stanley, a retired plumber who could tell you, without hesitation, exactly what his monthly outgoings were, down to the pound, and exactly what income he had coming in from every source. Not because he was obsessive about it, but because he'd sat down once, properly, years earlier, and built himself a simple, honest picture which he glanced at every few months to keep current. Contrast that with the far more common pattern of a vague, hopeful sense that things seem to be all right, which works perfectly well, right up until the moment it doesn't. Knowing your number precisely doesn't require an accountant or complicated spreadsheets. It requires perhaps 2 honest hours, once, and then a brief check-in every few months afterwards. That clarity alone prevents the single most common cause of money troubles in retirement, simply not noticing a slow drift into trouble until it's already become a genuine problem. Stanley told me the exercise he did all those years ago wasn't sophisticated at all, just a single sheet of paper divided into 2 honest columns, everything coming in on one side, everything genuinely going out on the other, added up, by hand, rather than any clever software. What mattered wasn't the method, he said, but the honesty of it, resisting the temptation to round figures favorably, or leave out the small, easily forgotten outgoings that add up considerably more than anyone expects, the odd subscription, the occasional takeaway, the small cash withdrawals that vanish without ever quite being accounted for. He redoes that same simple exercise every spring, not because his situation has changed dramatically, but because the discipline of checking, he found, matters more than any single number it reveals. Number 2, they separate needs from wants, without any guilt attached to either category. This might sound obvious, but the retirees whose money lasts have usually done something subtler than simply cutting back broadly. They've become genuinely clear-eyed about which spending is essential and which is a choice, made consciously and happily, rather than out of habit or unexamined assumption. I recall a lady named Beatrice, who cheerfully spent what some might consider a generous sum on weekly flowers for her home, an unashamed want that brought her real daily joy, while being notably frugal about a car she rarely used and eventually sold outright. She wasn't depriving herself. She was simply directing her money with clear intention toward what genuinely mattered to her, rather than letting habit or convention decide for her. The people whose money lasts aren't necessarily the ones who spend least. They're the ones who spend most deliberately. Beatrice described her approach rather charmingly. Once a year, she sat down and wrote out, honestly, the handful of things that brought her genuine joy: her weekly flowers, a particular subscription to a gardening magazine she genuinely read cover to cover, a monthly lunch with old friends, and then she gave herself full, guilt-free permission to spend generously on exactly those things, while examining everything else in her budget rather more critically. She told me the guilt so many people carry around spending, even on things they can genuinely afford, often does more damage to their mind than the spending itself. And that the antidote wasn't spending less overall, but with clear-eyed intention, so that every pound spent was either a considered joy or a genuine necessity, with very little left over, drifting vaguely in between. Number 3, they build in a buffer for the unexpected, rather than assuming everything will go according to plan. Life in retirement, just as in any other stage, throws up surprises: a boiler that fails, a car that needs unexpected repair, a dental bill that arrives out of nowhere. I think of a gentleman named Walter, who kept what he called his surprise fund, a modest, separate pot, specifically for exactly this kind of unplanned expense, replenished gradually whenever it was used. The retirees whose money doesn't last are very often not the ones who overspend on luxuries, but the ones who have no buffer at all, meaning every single surprise becomes a genuine crisis, often addressed with expensive credit, rather than savings set aside, specifically for this purpose. A buffer transforms the ordinary, inevitable surprises of life from emergencies into simple, manageable inconveniences. Walter's surprise fund had a rule attached to it that he considered just as important as the money itself. Whatever was taken out had to be replenished gradually over the following months before he allowed himself to consider it fully available again. This meant the fund never simply drained away permanently after being used once, the way so many good intentions around savings quietly do, but instead behaved more like a genuinely renewable resource, always there, always being topped back up, ready for whatever came next. He likened it to keeping a spare tire in the car. You hope never to need it. You don't resent the space it takes up, and you'd never dream of removing it simply because it's gone unused for a while. Number 4, and this is the one that surprises people most, because it isn't really about spending less at all. They review their finances regularly, rather than setting things up once and forgetting about them entirely. Interest rates change, energy tariffs change, insurance renewals often creep upward if left unchallenged, and the retirees whose money lasts tend to treat an annual, or even twice yearly, financial review as a genuinely worthwhile use of an afternoon. I think of a lady named Muriel, who made a simple habit of ringing round for better deals on her insurance and utilities every single year without fail, often saving several £100 annually for perhaps 2 hours of slightly tedious phone calls, an hourly rate, she liked to joke, considerably better than she'd ever earned during her working life. This isn't about obsessive penny pinching. It's about recognizing that many financial arrangements quietly drift toward being less favorable over time, unless someone actively checks and challenges them periodically. Muriel kept a simple diary reminder, set once and never needing to be reconsidered, to make these calls every January, treating it rather like an annual health check for her finances, done at the same time each year, regardless of how busy or reluctant she felt in the moment. She admitted the calls themselves were rarely enjoyable, often involving being passed between departments or waiting on hold longer than she'd like. But she'd learned to treat the mild tedium as simply the price of admission for meaningful savings. No different, she said, from putting up with an unpleasant but necessary visit to the dentist. The retirees whose money lasts, in her experience, weren't the ones who enjoyed this kind of admin. They were simply the ones who did it anyway, precisely because they understood what skipping it quietly cost them. Number 5. They're comfortable saying no to family requests that would genuinely compromise their own security, even when it's difficult. This is a delicate one, and I want to be careful here, because generosity is a beautiful thing, and I'm not suggesting anyone should become tight-fisted or unkind. But the retirees whose money lasts have usually learned, sometimes through hard experience, to distinguish between generosity they can genuinely afford and generosity that would quietly undermine their own future security. I recall a gentleman named Reginald, who helped his children meaningfully over the years, but always from a clearly defined, affordable amount, decided calmly in advance, rather than an open-ended sense of obligation that expanded to fill whatever was asked of him in the moment. He told me the clarity of having decided his limits beforehand away from the emotional pressure of an actual request made saying no. On the rare occasions it was necessary, far easier, and far less painful than deciding in the heat of the moment. He described one particular conversation with a grown child who'd hoped for help with a house deposit well beyond what he'd budgeted, and how, having already decided, calmly, months earlier, exactly what he could and couldn't stretch to, let him respond with a warm, unhurried, "Here's what I can genuinely offer, and here's why that's the right amount for both of us," rather than an anxious, guilty negotiation conducted under pressure in his own kitchen. His son, he told me, actually thanked him afterwards for the clarity, saying it was far easier to accept a considered, explained limit than a vague, uncomfortable feeling that he was somehow imposing on his father's security by asking at all. Number 6. They stay engaged with their money, rather than handing over all responsibility and stopping paying attention entirely. This doesn't mean managing every last detail alone, particularly as the years advance. Plenty of people quite sensibly get help from a trusted advisor or a family member as time goes on. But the retirees whose money lasts tend to remain genuinely aware of the broad picture. Checking statements, understanding roughly where their money sits and why, rather than disengaging completely and hoping everything continues to be handled correctly somewhere in the background. I think of a lady named Constance, well into her 80s, who still reviewed her bank statement every month with her daughter. Not because she distrusted anyone, but because she genuinely believed that staying engaged, even loosely, was part of staying capable, and that disengaging entirely from her own finances would have meant giving up a form of independence she wasn't ready to relinquish. Constance's daughter told me this monthly ritual had become something rather more than a financial check, a standing appointment the two of them both quietly looked forward to. Tea made, statement spread across the table. Questions asked and answered without any hurry. What began as a practical safeguard, she said, had gradually become one of the more reliable, comforting fixtures of her mother's month, proof that staying engaged with money needn't be a dry, joyless obligation, but could become, with the right person alongside you, something rather closer to a small monthly ritual of connection and reassurance. Number 7. They think in decades, not simply in months. This final habit ties all the others together. The retirees whose money lasts tend to make individual decisions, large and small, with an instinctive sense of the much longer horizon ahead of them, rather than optimizing purely for how comfortable this particular month feels. I recall a gentleman named Percival, who, when offered an appealing but risky investment promising unusually high returns, simply said, "I'm not investing for excitement. I'm investing so I don't have to worry about running out at 90. That single sentence, he told me, had quietly guided nearly every financial decision he'd made since retiring, gently steering him away from tempting shortcuts and toward the slower, steadier choices that actually protect a retirement lasting 20 or 30 years, rather than simply the next 12 months. Percival told me he'd developed this instinct rather painfully, having watched a close friend chase a similarly tempting opportunity decades earlier, only to lose a meaningful portion of his savings when it inevitably collapsed. That early lesson, learned at someone else's expense rather than his own, had stayed with him ever since, a permanent reminder that the promise of unusually high returns almost always carries a correspondingly high, if quietly hidden, risk attached, however reassuringly it's presented. He said the habit of thinking in decades had a wonderfully calming side effect, too. It made the ordinary ups and downs of markets and interest rates feel like weather passing over a long journey, rather than a crisis demanding an urgent, anxious response. Every time conditions shifted even slightly. Now, let me draw all 7 of these together into something practical you can begin this week, regardless of your current situation. Sit down for 2 honest hours and build yourself a clear picture of your actual number. Income against outgoings. Look honestly at your spending and separate genuine needs from conscious, guilt-free wants. If you don't already have one, start a modest buffer fund for life's inevitable surprises, even a small amount set aside regularly. Put a date in the diary, right now, for an annual review of your insurance, utilities, and broader finances. Decide calmly and in advance what you can genuinely afford to give family, so any future request can be met with clarity rather than pressured improvisation. Stay gently engaged with your own money, even if someone else helps manage the details. And whenever a financial decision arises, ask yourself Percival's question: am I optimizing for this month or for the next 2 or 3 decades? Let me close with something Stanley, the retired plumber from the start of this video, said to me that has stayed with me ever since. He told me, "I never earned a fortune, and I never will, but I've never once lain awake at night worrying about money, and I know plenty of people who earned 3 times what I did who can't say the same." When I asked him what he thought made the real difference, he simply shrugged and said, "I just always knew where I stood, and I never let myself pretend otherwise, even when the truth wasn't what I wanted to hear." That in the end might be the simplest way to summarize all 7 of these habits. Not brilliance, not luck, but a quiet, consistent willingness to look honestly at the truth of your own situation, again and again, for as long as it takes. It's worth saying, too, that none of these 7 habits require a particular personality type, a head for figures, or any special financial background. Stanley left school at 15 to train as a plumber, and would be the first to laugh at any suggestion he was some kind of natural financial mind. What he had instead was simply a willingness to build a small number of honest habits once, and then repeat them without much drama, year after year, letting the habits themselves do the quiet work that talent or luck might otherwise have had to provide. That, in the end, is genuinely good news, because it means every single one of these 7 habits is entirely available to you too, starting from wherever you happen to be standing today, regardless of what your relationship with money has looked like up until now. If this spoke to you today, please subscribe, because every week I share these honest, practical lessons for our later years, and I would love to have you along for the next one. And I would genuinely love to know, in the comments, which of these 7 habits you already practice, and which one you might start this week, because sharing what's worked for you might be exactly the encouragement someone else watching needs today. I read every single comment. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.
That's the story of Ellen's hidden hearth, a wall nobody understood until the cold made its case for her. If you want more real winter survival engineering like this every week, subscribe to The Hidden Hearth and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.